I'm Travis Frame, and this is Frame by Frame, and this is going to be a video of my top 50 horror movies of all time. If you know me, you know that my lists change all the time. These movies could be different in a month, in a week, they could be different in an hour. But as of right now, this is my top 50 horror movies of all time. There's some hot takes, some very controversial opinions, but it was a really fun list to put together and just really highlight some of my favorites. I didn't always love horror. Obviously, that's not the case now. I'm wearing my Shudder shirt, which is a great horror streaming service, and it's become one of my favorite genres. I've seen hundreds of horror movies, so this list was really hard to put together. But if you are not a horror fan, maybe you can get some enjoyment out of the list as well. Maybe you find a horror movie that speaks to you, that kind of helps introduce you to the genre. And if you are a longtime horror fan, maybe you see one that you haven't seen and you get a new horror favorite. Or you hate me because of my terrible recommendations. But either way, I hope you enjoy the list. Starting off strong with number 50 is Poltergeist. The 1982 classic is a classic for a reason. I immediately knew why people loved it as soon as I watched it the first time. It has amazing practical effects, some really spooky moments, and is very deserving of the title of a classic. Number 49 is 2018's Climax. It is trippy, it's uncomfortable. It's about these dancers that are trapped in this building after their sangria is spiked, and it's a weird one, it's a uncomfortable one. It's by far the best Gaspar Noé movie, maybe the only good one, but it's well worth a watch if you can stomach some of the weirdness that happens. Number 48 is The Wolf House from 2018. It might be the shortest movie on the list, but it packs so much into its haunting visuals. It is stop motion, but mostly done with large paper mache creatures and painting on walls. It is truly unique. It really dials the stop motion creepiness up to 11. If you thought Coraline was creepy, this movie's going to terrify you. It's a little bit jumbled and confusing narratively, kind of all over the place, especially when you're distracted by the insane visuals, but it's totally worth a watch and very, very well done. Number 47 is 2019's Ready or Not. It's a great movie that has so much fun with its ridiculous concept. It is contained and wacky. It's kind of satirical, but it's really, really fun. And one of those horror movies that's like, it's not going to scare you, but it is a thrilling, really good time. Number 46 is The Conjuring from 2013. Obviously, the Conjuring universe has become huge and to very mixed quality with the various films. For me, I knew one was going to make it on the list. It was a debate over whether to put this or a movie like Annabelle Creation, which I also really love. But The Conjuring just has James Wan's signature horror style. It's kind of grimy, but still has the slickness of Wan's filmmaking, and I think is still the best of the franchise. Number 45 is going to be from 1975, and that's Jaws. This was definitely one of the more contentious ones on this list. From researching, a lot of people don't consider this to be a horror movie, but one of my friends said that if a movie is so terrifying it scares people from doing something, just like Jaws scared people from going for a swim, it's a horror movie. And I'm inclined to agree. I think it's scary, it's obviously iconic. Spielberg is an absolute legend. I really wish he would do some more horror movies. Don't think that's probably ever going to happen, but thank goodness we have Jaws because it is spectacular. Number 44 is going to be Saw 3. Again, this is going to be a very unpopular opinion to some, but this is my second favorite Saw movie, and in my opinion, one of the best horror sequels of all time. I think that when viewed as a trilogy, Saw 1, 2, 3 is fantastic and one of the best horror trilogies of all time. I think that despite how much I love this franchise, it drops off significantly after this movie, with some bright spots here and there. Although one of the more difficult movies in the franchise to watch, it has really good writing, great characters, and it's just a really great cap to what was this original trilogy. Number 43 is The Descent from 2005. The movie is claustrophobic throughout, it's unnerving. I haven't seen the sequel yet, but the first is such a great horror movie experience. It feels contained, it feels uncomfortable, the creatures are really uncomfortable, and it is just one that had not a lot of expectations going into, but really loved it. Number 42 is The Mist from 2007. Part of the reason I made this video in black and white is because of The Mist and the eeriness that I feel like black and white gives to horror. Despite the fact that only 3 of the 50 movies on this list are actually in black and white, I think that's the best way to watch The Mist. I feel like it adds a lot of eeriness to it. So if you haven't seen The Mist, I would recommend watching it in black and white. I think it just has a more creepy atmosphere. It's shocking to me that the director of this also directed The Shawshank Redemption. Very, very different movies, tonally, conceptually, but it is a really good horror movie, and I highly recommend it. Number 41 is 2017's The Killing of a Sacred Deer. It's not my favorite Yorgos, but it's definitely the creepiest. It's not the weirdest, but it's by far the most unnerving. It's so intentionally awkward that it becomes incredibly uncomfortable to watch. Barry is at his peak awkward weirdo state in this. If you thought he was weird in a movie like Saltburn, give Killing of a Sacred Deer a watch, and it pales in comparison. Really weird movie. I think it again shows how diverse of a filmmaker Yorgos is, and I hope he makes a couple more horror-esque movies like this in the future. Number 40 is going to be 1992's Dead Alive / Brain Dead, whichever one you prefer to call it. It's one of the earliest Peter Jackson movies, and while it has a lot of flaws, it's an absolute blast. I've shown it to 2 different groups of friends, and we've had so much fun watching it. Sometimes it's really gross to the point of turning your head away just because it's why? But when it kicks itself into gear, it does not let up, and it's such a wild time that is so much fun. Great for a horror movie night, for just a lot of fun. Number 39 is going to be the Evil Dead remake from 2013. While I love the original, I think the cabin in the woods style, isolated aspect of Evil Dead lends itself more to the gory and terrifying than the goofy. I still love the goofy. Evil Dead 2 was so close to making it on this list, but I went with this one. I think it's one of the best horror remakes of all time, and just a truly gnarly horror movie. Number 38 is going to be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. It's the second Tobe Hooper movie on this list after Poltergeist. While some say it hasn't aged particularly well, I still think it's super creepy. For a franchise that's become synonymous with gore, the original is surprisingly reserved while still having all of the moments that make you uncomfortable. If gore is more your thing, then the 2003 remake is a really good one that also was considered for this list. But for me, it's not on the same level as the original. The original has definitely been a very influential horror movie for me, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you've been scared away from it because you've been afraid it's just a gore fest. Number 37 is Happy Death Day from 2017. I love this movie so much. I have been obsessed with the Blumhouse trend of taking movie concepts and combining them with horror. The Back to the Future-esque Totally Killer, the Freaky Friday inspired Freaky, both are amazing, but it's the Groundhog Day style slasher in Happy Death Day that I love the most. It has a great sequel too, but the original is at Blumhouse, I think, at its peak. It's one of the only PG-13 horror movies on this list, and in my opinion, the best PG-13 slasher movie of all time. It's fun, it's spooky, and it's not so intense that it's going to scare away a lot of people that are maybe normally against the gore or bloodiness of traditional slasher movies. Number 36 is The Thing from 1982. I have not seen the original, so I cannot comment on its quality as a remake, but John Carpenter is so skilled, and this movie is another classic for a reason. On a list full of hot takes and polarizing movies, this one is nearly universally beloved, and that's for a very good reason, because it is so fantastic. Number 35 is going to be Army of Darkness from 1992. It's my favorite of the Evil Dead franchise. I know earlier I said I preferred the terrifying to the goofy, but that's more when it's in the woods. This is one of the coolest, most over-the-top movies of all time. Sure, it's a little bit dated, but it's so funny. It's such a great time. By far the best of the goofiness in the trilogy of the originals, the series as a whole, and has one of my favorite horror movie worlds of all time with the medieval fantasy setting. It's just so ridiculous, but so amazing at the same time. Number 34 is Green Room from 2015, one of the best contained horrors of all time for me. Some may consider it more of a thriller, but to me, it has such a horrific quality to it. Whether it's the uneasiness of the actual plot or the brutality of the violence, it sits firmly in the horror genre to me. It has really creepy antagonists, really interesting protagonists, and overall just really takes full use of that contained horror aspect. Number 33 is going to be the original Halloween from 1978. It's the second John Carpenter on the list, one of the greatest horror movie directors of all time. And for me, it's been one of the most influential horror movies of all time. I definitely think that there are parts of it that are dated, but it still stands up in so many ways. It's one of the core movies that helped get me into the horror genre. Jamie Lee Curtis is obviously amazing, and I can't recommend this movie enough to people who are getting into the genre as one of the classics that is why horror is what horror is today. Number 32 is Possessor from 2020. I am admittedly not super well versed in the work of David Cronenberg, but in just a few movies, his son, Brandon Cronenberg, has become a phenomenal director to me. He is unflinching, he is brutal, and Possessor, I think, is his peak of that. Antiviral and Infinity Pool are also really unnerving, but I think Possessor takes its sci-fi concept and combines it with the kind of staple Cronenberg family body horror and makes such a disturbing movie. Number 31 is 2014's It Follows. Under the Silver Lake might be my favorite David Robert Mitchell film, but It Follows is just as unique. It's terrifying, and I hope we get more horror movies from David Robert Mitchell because It Follows is just such a great horror movie. It's been such an influential modern horror movie for such a good reason. Micah Monroe is fantastic in the movie, and the originality of it is just so good. Another movie that I feel like is a go-to horror movie recommendation for me. Number 30 is going to be Vivarium from 2019. I was almost swayed into not watching this due to very poor reviews, and as soon as I watched it, I understood why. Not because I think the movie's bad. Obviously, it's number 30 in my favorite horror movies of all time. It is so bizarre and off-putting that I get why it's not for everyone. But it definitely worked for me. I think that the two leads are so good together at expressing the confusion and terror of this weird neighborhood that they find themselves in, and I loved how bizarre it was. Number 29 is The Woman in Black from 2012. It's another one of the rare PG-13 entries on this list, and one of the rare PG-13 horror movies that manages to actually scare me. So many PG-13 movies feel watered down, yet this feels exactly like what it wants to be, and that just happens to be what it was rated. It wasn't rated PG-13 to make more money or to have a broader audience. It was just, that's what it was. And I think that that's part of why it's such an effective movie for this rating, and just an effective horror movie in general. Radcliffe is fantastic and is one I did not expect to love as much as I did when I first watched it, but I really, really like it. Number 28 is going to be The Lighthouse from 2019. I do not love The Witch very much. After watching that, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to be a Robert Eggers fan, but he proved me totally wrong with The Lighthouse. It's weird, it's ominous, two unbelievable performances from Dafoe and Pattinson that are just unhinged and wild. And again, another example of weird, bizarre horror that just really worked for me. Number 27 is going to be Gerald's Game from 2017. I know a lot of people are huge fans of Mike Flanagan, and I think his stuff has been a little bit hit or miss for me, but this has been by far my favorite of his work. Something about this movie just genuinely terrified me during and after watching it. I think it's super underrated. I think it's really creepy, and I definitely am intrigued by Mike Flanagan's work, not just because of this, but his other horror work. But I think this one is where he especially shines. Number 26 is going to be A Quiet Place from 2018. I love the concept, as sound has always been such an integral part of horror movies and the horror experience, and putting it at the forefront as the primary source of scares and terror is amazing. It's not the first movie to have done that, and it's not going to be the last, but it does it in such a skillful, eerie way. John Krasinski does such an outstanding job creating the world of A Quiet Place, and I shamefully have not seen the sequel or the prequel yet, but that's definitely going to change soon because of how much I love this movie. Number 25 is going to be Midsommar from 2019. Another one of my unpopular opinions is that Midsommar was a step up from Hereditary for me. I really loved Hereditary, but for me, Ari Aster added so much depth, so much terror, and so much complexity to his horror storytelling with Midsommar. I think being able to tell a scary movie primarily in the light, primarily in the day, is a very impressive feat, and I think that he accomplishes so much with so many layers in this movie that it really, really hit me when I watched it the first time and the following times as well. Number 24 is going to be The Invisible Man from 2020. To me, Leigh Whannell is such a fantastic writer. I think he's one of the best modern horror writers. This was another fringe thriller horror pick for me, but to me it leans enough into the horror for me to categorize it as such. Elizabeth Moss is amazing in this movie. Leigh Whannell has improved so much as a director since Insidious 3, but after that he did Upgrade, which is such a great sci-fi movie, and then returned to the horror genre with Invisible Man, making such a unnerving, tense movie, and I can't wait to see more horror projects from him as a writer-director in the future. Number 23 is going to be Antichrist from 2009. If you know me, you know that I am a big Lars von Trier fan. While this movie is incredibly difficult to watch, I think that part of what makes it such a good horror movie is that so many movies are disturbing just to be disturbing. And if you've seen my video essay series on the Depression trilogy, you know that I don't think that this movie is disturbing just to be disturbing. It has so many layers to it. It has a depth to its depravity, and is just haunting to watch. I would say it's so disturbing I'd never watch it again, but I did rewatch it for that video essay series. But it's a tough one to revisit, but if you can stomach it, it's pretty great. Number 22 is Bone Tomahawk from 2015. The unlikely combination of the Western and the horror here immediately seems kind of odd, but it works so well. The movie is definitely a slow burn, but director-writer S. Craig Zahler manages his characters and story so well. Just as he does with his other non-horror movies, he does such a fantastic job creating the story and the world here that really just engages you. And I hope we get more horror westerns because it's just such a fun combination. Number 21 is going to be One Cut of the Dead from 2017. This is a movie that when I first heard about it, I was so excited. I heard about it from a podcast about horror movies, and I was just waiting for it to come out. And when it did, it totally lived up to my expectations. It's a micro-budget horror movie, and it's very unconventional take on the zombie genre, and the less you know about it going in, the better. And it's just a really fun watch. Number 20 is going to be Psycho from 1960. It is so good. It may not be my favorite Hitchcock of all time, but to me, no horror movie list is complete without the master of suspense, and he's known as that for a reason. It's the oldest movie on this list by 14 years, and it still packs a punch, which just shows how well crafted this movie that is 64 years old at this point. It just really stands the test of time, and is one of the best horror movies ever made. Number 19 is The Night Eats the World from 2018. It's a very recent watch for me, but as of right now, this is my favorite zombie movie of all time. I think the emphasis on character and small-scale survival makes it so much more interesting than a lot of other large-scale apocalypse-style zombie movies. It's so interesting in how it contains itself that I highly recommend it. Number 18 is Sinister from 2012. This movie gets a lot of credit for scaring horror fans who don't scare easily, and I am no exception to that. I think this movie is genuinely scary, and part of that is the great writing, the great performances that really boost the terror of the story. I think when you ask a lot of people what the scariest movie of all time is, Sinister is a quite common answer, and justifiably so. Number 17 is Beau is Afraid from 2023. The second Ari Aster on this list and my favorite of his work. Despite being by far the longest movie on this list by almost 30 minutes, it packs nearly every second of its almost 3-hour runtime with constantly anxiety-inducing sequences. It is so stressful, it's so weird, it's so out there, and obviously that means it's a movie that I love. So it's not going to be for everyone. I know some people that really, really hate it, but I think that for what it's trying to do, it works so well. Number 16 is Saw from 2004. As I've said already in this video, James Wan and Leigh Whannell are horror juggernauts. They have changed the horror landscape, probably permanently. It's genuinely not what it is today without these two. From Insidious to The Conjuring to the Saw franchise, these two are masters of the craft of horror, from writing and directing. Without them, horror is different, and Saw is the movie that started it all and remains my favorite work from either of them. I think conceptually it's interesting, execution-wise it's interesting, and I think that we owe so much to Saw as horror fans for what horror is today. Number 15 is A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. Just like John Carpenter, Wes Craven is a horror master. Nightmare on Elm Street is another one of the most influential movies of all time for me in terms of the horror genre. Freddy might be my favorite horror movie character of all time. I think that while this franchise has some incredibly low lows, the original and some of the sequels are such high highs that it has really shaped how I viewed horror movies, how I view horror movie characters, and it is just such an impactful movie for me. Number 14 is going to be The Shining from 1980. Jack Nicholson gives an all-time performance as the unhinged Jack Torrance. The eeriness of the hotel and Kubrick's great directing helped this one stand the test of time. It's such a creepy movie. It's very weird. It's one of the first horror movies I think I ever watched, and still to this day is obviously one of my favorites. Number 13 is It from 2017. It's going to be back-to-back Stephen King adaptations and the fourth on this list. And for me, it is the best of the Stephen King horror adaptations. While part 2 is not as strong as the first, I feel like this one can almost act as a contained story. And I think Pennywise is one of the most terrifying characters ever put to screen. I think all of the actors do such a good job embodying the fear, and Bill Skarsgård is unbelievable as Pennywise. Number 12 is going to be Scream from 1996. It's the second Wes Craven on this list. It's iconic in the world of meta horror and showcases how talented Wes Craven is. The series, I think, is one of the most consistently good horror franchises of all time, with not a single movie that I've disliked. Even though I think that the franchise is a little bit weaker in the post-Craven era, they're still solid. But the original, again, another foundational horror movie for me, and one that I love to show people and talk to people about. Number 11 is Crimson Peak from 2015. It's my favorite Del Toro movie, and for me, it's the best use of his specific type of horror combined with his immaculate character studies. It's not really a scary movie, but more of a gothic horror romance. And I think that when you go into the movie expecting that, you are so much more rewarded than thinking it's going to be a jump scare fest or a true monster movie like some of Del Toro's movies are. It's layered, it has fantastic characters, and genuinely has my favorite production design of, I think, any movie I've ever seen with the house, and is one of the big reasons that I have wanted to pursue the career of production design, is thanks to Crimson Peak, because it's just so well crafted as a world, as a place, and as a story. Number 10 is 10 Cloverfield Lane from 2016. It is led by 3 amazing performances. It's a contained story, great writing, tense directing. It's so impactful. I have some friends who did not like certain aspects of this movie, and I totally understand that. But for me, it's nearly seamless as a tense, contained horror thriller. Number 9 is The Cabin in the Woods from 2011. This is, to me, meta horror at its peak. It's wild, it's ridiculous, and to me, it's a horror movie that fans of horror will love because of all of the references and the meta horror aspects, while somehow it still manages to be fairly accessible to non-horror fans. It's another one of my favorite go-to horror movie night movies because I feel like it has such a wide appeal because of the comedic elements, because of the meta elements, and because of the traditional horror elements. It's just so good. Number 8 is going to be Alien from 1979. Sci-fi and horror work so well together. I love the Alien series, but it's really this original that is so important and special to me. It has nearly flawless atmosphere with its production design. It has not just an all-time horror movie character, but one of the greatest movie characters of all time in Ripley, one of the greatest horror movie monster antagonists of all time with the xenomorph, and it just makes it a true all-timer for me. Number 7 is going to be 2010's I Saw the Devil. Not just my favorite foreign language horror film of all time, but my favorite Korean movie of all time. And honestly, it's one of my favorite foreign language films in general. It is so haunting and immensely disturbing with how brutally violent and tragic it is. The only reason it's not higher is because sometimes it delves into that disturbing for disturbing sake territory. But for the most part, I feel like it avoids that and just presents one of the most unnerving, serial killer focused movies ever made. Number 6 is Annihilation from 2018. The next couple and the final movies on this list I feel like are where the list gets super controversial. All of these movies have impacted me in a certain way that have put them on this list, and Annihilation is no different. I know it is highly polarizing. Some people think that it's one of the worst movies they've ever seen, but I think that, again, sci-fi and horror fit so well together. While this movie is definitely not as much of a horror movie as some other ones on this list, definitely not as much of a horror as a movie like Alien, it has so many layers in its dramatic aspects that add to interesting characters, complex themes, some really powerful emotions, and still has some really unnerving horror elements, both in the actual direct scary moments, but also in terms of just thematic kind of terror. And that's part of why I love this movie so much. Number 5 is going to be Men from 2022. It's back-to-back Alex Garland movies for me, and Men is genuinely one of the most unnerving movies I've ever seen. Walking back from the theater was such a creepy, terrifying experience purely because of how impacted I was by this movie. And like I said with Sinister, some of these horror movies I just have a fun time watching. Some of them have genuinely scared me, and this is definitely one of them. I think Alex Garland is a master of horror with Men and Annihilation, and his other movies, Ex Machina and Civil War. I think he's such a great director, and I hope Civil War is not his retirement, because I'd love to see more horror from him in the future, like Men. Number 4 on this list is by far the most recent entry. It's the most recent watch, It is Longlegs from 2024. Maybe it's recency bias, but I genuinely loved every single thing about this movie. It has a very divisive third act that will put a lot of people off. It's going to lose a lot of people. I've talked to people that aspect of the movie lost them, but I loved where it went. I loved the horror. I loved the drama. Again, Maika Monroe, amazing performance. I think this one is going to become a really impactful horror movie. I'm so happy to see it do so well at the box office because I genuinely think it is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Number 3 is Suspiria from 2018. The original is solid, but I think that what Luca Guadagnino does with the 2018 remake expands and improves on nearly every aspect of that movie. It's darker atmosphere, it's more complex and disturbing themes, combined with some of the most truly horrific sequences I've seen in horror, make it such a disturbing but layered and complicated movie that works so well for me. I remember the first time I watched it and just being blown away at what I had experienced. Number 2 is going to be Mother from 2017. It is so metaphorical that literally every single aspect of the movie is a metaphor for something. And I think it uses that so well to its advantage. It makes the movie complicated. It has a lot of things to say with its horror, with its terror. It's bizarre. It's uncomfortable. I think Jennifer Lawrence is amazing in it. And I just think that, again, despite how divisive it is, I think it really accomplishes everything it wants to do in such an interesting way. And number 1 is going to be The House That Jack Built from 2018. I think it's Lars von Trier's best work. I think it's the best horror movie I've ever seen. I think it's one of the most, if not the most disturbing movies I've ever watched, with probably the exception being Martyrs. But The House That Jack Built, I think, embodies everything about horror that terrifies me. It is a movie about pure evil, pure terror, but has so much more to that. It is a allegorical film that has a lot of metaphorical references and things that I can't talk about without spoiling the movie, which I won't do. It's a movie that I love to talk about. It's such a hard movie to watch. It is definitely not my favorite to watch out of the movies on this list, but I do think it's the best horror movie I've ever seen because of how it integrates its horror aspects into the story that it's trying to tell in a way that to me is essentially perfect. Thank you so much for watching. I know no one agrees with this list, but hopefully maybe you have a couple new movies added to your watch list that you didn't have before, maybe you hadn't heard of before. Like I said, this list might change in an hour, in a week, but what won't change is I genuinely love all 50 of these movies. I think they're great horror movies. I think they're great movies in general. And I hope that people enjoy them as much as I have. Thank you.